PTF back with you. If you're listening to the podcast version, if you're watching the video, we're joining you for the first time. PTF with Nick Tammaro. Nick, what's going on? I asked you that just as you took a sip of coffee. Bad
I'm
time.
doing great, Pete. Obviously in need of more coffee, but that never changes, and that fits with the discussion of this recap.
That's about right. Let's start off. That's right. And it's an elegant and artful segue, as it was, talking about coffee and talking about instant coffee, who I think incorrectly had hypothesized before the Lecomte. Hey, is this a horse who maybe, has had enough form in the book that maybe isn't as likely to take an explosive move forward? I kind of felt like he did take an explosive move forward, especially when you consider the trip for this horse, pretty much wide throughout and runs a really good time. And I just thought looked very stylish in victory in the Lecomte in a race that came back pretty strong on the clock. What did you think of it?
I thought it was the necessary step forward, no doubt about it. I mean, from a Beyer speed figure perspective, he improved by 10 points off the Kentucky Jockey Club. I don't think it changes my theory on the Kentucky Jockey Club that the off the pace horses were helped. All things considered, and so the reference points on Saturday are the clearest reference point is Louisiana, which was the race right before, and the Silver Bullet Day to a slightly lesser extent, but still a race worth comparing it to. And I think the inevitable conclusion is that Instant Coffee got a really good setup. He got a very strong pace to run at for this level and this time of year. And Echo again, who I accurately predicted after his debut was not going to be a graded stake horse. And I hate to put it that way because I know he was pulled up. I hope he's okay. So Instant Coffee got the best of it. He certainly looked more professional. I thought that it was the type of race that you'd like to see from a Derby contender because he's probably going to have to come from off of it. Will he be able to negotiate a clean trip in a field of 20 with pace in front of him that spreads the field out even more? That's what we'll have to see in subsequent starts. And maybe we see him twice more in the Risen Star and Louisiana Derby, or maybe he goes elsewhere. And but we'll see. I thought it was a very compelling effort from Two Phils, who I didn't like. But I guess keeping the conversation at this point to Instant Coffee, it was the appropriate step forward, and he continues to look like a horse that's a very serious player on the trail.
The pattern is going to look real nice on paper, I think, the next time we look at him. That was really the move we were looking for. Now, let's clarify something about the Kentucky Jockey Club, because I think a lot of people listening are going to say, wait a second, he closed there and it was a slow pace, but you made an excellent point. I just want you to reiterate it about why you thought that unusual race flow might still have favored a runner like Instant Coffee there.
Yeah, this is kind of a problem that we see with a lot of modern jockeys in that they're a little afraid of using a horse's speed. And I don't know whether it's that they don't want to explain themselves to the trainers or what, but we get all of these packs just stuck together, especially in route races on dirt, much more so than we used to. Gone are the days of guys like Angel Cordero or Lafitte Pincay that knew how to separate a field a little bit and make it much more difficult to keep up with those horses that would really sort of do away with your late kick. And so the Kentucky Jockey Club, being a race where the pack was so stuck together, also being a two-turn race, not early in a 2-year-old season, but still for 2-year-olds, the horses that could finish had such an advantage when they had such a marginal deficit at the quarter pole. And so, if you turn a situation where the reason why, and this is a crude comparison, but the reason why speed horses win match races so much is because they force their opponent to keep up with them. And that is going to keep you from finishing with the same amount of gusto. And so when you do that and you take your pace advantage, you negate it by basically turning everything into a 2-furlong sprint, and the closers have a decided advantage on dirt. There's just no substitute for it. It's the reason why closers in general struggle in dirt routes, and you'll go broke betting on deep closers in dirt routes because they don't have enough pace to run at. But in this scenario where you're allowing them to get so much closer, now their job gets a lot easier. And I think the Kentucky Jockey Club was about as clear a high profile example of that as we've seen in recent years. And I do think, Pete, that them being 2-year-olds had something to do with it too. Being that there were horses in there going long for the first time or going a longer distance than they ever had.
I think you made so many great points. We've talked about this. This is JK. The phrase he uses is inviting the closers into the race. We see that. We talk about speed as a weapon. And then that's just something in one's understanding of races that I think will help you a lot in designing races and trying to figure out what's going to happen on the track. When you think about it from the jockey's point of view, when a horse is especially a speed horse, is a doubtful stayer, when you're not sure if they're going to get that distance, typically they'll try to go slower early. Sometimes it can be to their detriment. Sometimes it can work out. But, there's a lot of nuance here, but I thought it was an excellent point and one worth highlighting. I did want to talk a little bit more about Two Phils, who you alluded to liking this effort. This was a horse who was put up by Eric DeCoster as a potentially interesting one to look at going forward. Eric's doing great work, as is Eric Solomon over on InTheMoneyPodcast.com. We encourage folks to go over there and check it out. What was it about Two Phil's performance that you liked in here?
Instant Coffee, Luis Saez basically treated Two Phils as a fullback, right? He followed him around there. And as soon as Two Phils moved, Instant Coffee started to move. The difference is that, Saez, as I've said before, is all armed. So he's like flapping away at the 3/8 pole while Two Phils was still moving what looked like pretty easily. But Instant Coffee was really just getting into the grinding mode there. From a race flow perspective, Two Phils had it a little bit tougher than Instant Coffee. He didn't have it tough in that he really benefited from the same amount of pace. The difference is that I thought he had a little less foundation and that it had been longer since he ran. He also has a trainer that's a little bit less, I don't want to say familiar because Larry Ravelli's been training for a long time, but a little less accustomed to getting a 3-year-old route horse on dirt ready for a race like this. And I think maybe slightly more inclined to let him kind of run his way into a little bit more fitness, if that makes sense. So I thought he ran well. I would back him in worth noting. He actually came back on the gallop out too. So I don't know if maybe that was more Instant Coffee kind of being throttled down pretty quickly, but he is a horse that I didn't particularly like on Saturday. I thought he ran a lot better than I expected. And so I'd be happy to back him in a race maybe that is going to have, I think his best chance is going to be sitting closer in a slower paced race and holding more of an edge into the stretch than basically being a length and a half up on a real grinding closer like Instant Coffee.
Taking a look quickly here at the closing prices for the future bet. Forte ended up getting bet too much. I wasn't going to mess around at anything less.
Oh, you weren't intrigued by 7-1?
Yes, 7-1 is a little skinny, I thought. Though it's interesting. I was saying that it's almost like the old days, like in the old days, that's the price I would have guessed. The other thing is that the board didn't exactly tilt on the all other 3-year-old males. I mean, a heavy favorite at 2-1, but nothing like insane.
Nothing like I expected. I said 4-5.
Yeah. So I mean, that's another piece of it. It's always hard when you're guessing these things. Two Phils clocking in at 91-1, Instant Coffee 15-1 in there. Either of those numbers intrigue you at all?
No, not really. Two Phils at 91-1, definitely more so than Instant Coffee at 15-1. My Two Phils concern is that I still think there are some necessary reservations about exactly how far he wants to go. So he doesn't scream 10 furlong type. Instant Coffee looks like a Derby horse at this point, but we're a long way from home. And 15-1, I mean, just looking at it theoretically, taking all of the 3-year-olds that weren't in that pool out of the equation for a second, Instant Coffee might be the third most backed horse from his barn. Right. And so the likelihood that he's a lot less than 15-1 is very, very low.
Yeah, it's at least 50-50, and that might be, I might be underselling it. Echo again did walk off. You mentioned that unfortunate having to be pulled up, but hopefully that's a good sign. You have no interest on the cutback. See, I would still give a chance to be a top quality horse. I just think that he's been playing the wrong game.
Yeah, I was being boorish about it. On the cutback, sure. I think he could be a perfectly fine sprinter. I think that I still have this, I don't know what exactly the word is, but I loved Stellar Tap so much after his 2-year-old win at Saratoga. And it looked a lot like Echo again, except it was slower, but he got the lead. He wired the field. And then it was just, he was one of those horses that peaked in Saratoga and he never got back to it. And I thought Echo Again's race debut was so dressed up. The funny thing about Echo Again, and we touched on it on Friday, was that he was leading that race that got called off halfway through. And so you can't find a replay of it anywhere. And I asked our mutual friend, Travis Stone, who's the race caller at Churchill, he's like, he would have won by 10. He was cruising, he was good. So I'm like, well, man, maybe he is a router, and then the Dull Remington race and this, I think he probably needs to just be rerouted to shorter races. The good thing is this barn is very astute when it comes to spotting the horses that should stay in route races. And these are the people that cut back Jackie's Warrior. They've cut back, a number of horses over the years that looked like they were a little distance challenged. So yeah, Woody Stevens and Pat Daymile look like the graded stake races in the future for Echo again.
All right, just wanted to clarify on that one before we move on. Let's talk about some allowance action, starting with that allowance race at Fairgrounds on Saturday that, as you noted off air, might be more significant in who didn't show up than who did. And there was that weird thing that, we had Frank McGoey on the plus side saying that all of the sources he were hearing was saying that Tappett's Conquest was going to go in the Lecomte, and then they end up going in the allowance. Tyler Wisman and I were chatting, and Tyler was like, well, if Frank liked him in the Lecomte, you must think he's a lock in the allowance race. And my comment on that was not necessarily like sometimes that lack of confidence when you see that late on with connections making a decision, sometimes that can be really telling. And perhaps that's some of what was going on there. Give us your thoughts on this allowance race. And you think it might have some relevance going forward?
Yeah, at the very least, it tells you the respect that a guy like Brad Cox has for Banishing, who was scratched out of here. And I think that ultimately was why Tappett's Conquest was routed here, because, presumably it was going to be a softer race. I didn't love the ride that Tappett's Conquest got. The race we're speaking of was the 9th on Saturday, determinedly wired the field. He set a very, very slow pace. He went 25-1, 48-4. So this was a mile and a 16th race that finished in 45.26. For comparison purposes, the Lecomte finished in 45.12. Now, in all likelihood, this track slowed down. I think there's a very decent chance of it. A lot of times when the lights come on, that happens. But I will say, and Randy Moss treated it that way in terms of buyer speed figures. He made about a 6-point adjustment in terms of the track slowing down. This particular race, Tappett's Conquest really didn't have much set up. He's a horse, though, that broke his maiden stalking the pace and practically setting the pace. So I think that Florent Giroux is maybe a little conservative in the way he rode him. With that said, Pete, we're talking about a horse that was in the Derby future wager pool. He was probably supposed to win. He did kind of get wedged inside a little bit late. He didn't have a clear path for the whole way down the stretch. He maybe was a little reticent to come through on the inside. He gets a shot in the Risen Star, in my opinion. He deserves to go. He looks like a horse who will really benefit from more ground, but it didn't have that. This is the race that we referenced on Friday that Cyberknife won last year. It was a one other than that he won. He ran a faster final time than the Lecomte, and everybody, was up in arms when the buyer figures were adjusted. But it didn't have that panache this year. It didn't have that, that element that was like, okay, well, these horses might be very, very serious.
Banishing, you mentioned how there was an incident in the stall. He was cast in the stall, I think they said, and picked up a knock that ultimately I think they think is going to be minor. But what they say with Derby horses, sometimes even the seemingly insignificant setbacks can, everything has to go right in a typical year for a horse to, really arrive. What are you hearing about next steps for him? Will they'll just go on and head to stakes action if they can get in?
Yeah, I'm assuming that since they didn't go to the Southwest, that Brendan Walsh will probably just reroute him to the Risen Star and start to train him towards that. This is obviously a horse with very little foundation as well. He had 2 starts at 2. He did go the route already, though, in winning on Boxing Day. So, it's obviously not. I guess what it all depends on is what Brendan's plan was prior to the Lecomte. If he planned on running him 3 times, it's probably a little bit more of a setback. But if he was thinking of doing like Lecomte, Louisiana Derby, Kentucky Derby, then it's not that big a deal, in my opinion. It'll just probably require him to maybe get after him a little bit more in training over the next few weeks. There's something to be said also for letting these 3-year-olds knock heads early in the year and maybe beat on each other a little bit before you get back into the fray. But in an ideal world, he would have run on Saturday. And I'll tell you, the way that race unfolded, if he had been on the lead, he would have won.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. While we're talking allowance races for 3-year-olds, there was one at Aqueduct to close out the day. And because Brad Cox doesn't have enough fast 3-year-olds, we got another one of his to talk about here, Slip Mahoney, who got the job done nearly wire to wire in a race that played out a bit like a match race.
Yeah, it was, there was a well-fancied 2-year-old at Saratoga that ran in his it really ran late in his debut, Krupe, who came back and was overbet in the maiden race next time out, ran in one of those closing weekend maiden races. And one of the horses the horse that he ran into on Saturday was Slip Mahoney, who had been beaten by Tapit Trice in a maiden race at Aqueduct in December. And so Slip Mahoney came back and broke his maiden on Saturday. This is just a really sexy, slow, long distance pedigree, right? He's by Arrogate out of Got Lucky. Got Lucky is a mare who won the Spinster. She ran down on Tappable in the Spinster in 2015, I believe, for Todd Pletcher. She was a Hillendale horse. This is like all distance on the damn side, Pete. I mean, this is a horse you should run forever. So he's another Al Gold Square horse, maybe one that Brad might end up looking a little bit more towards a race like the Belmont, but he'll get his shot. The tricky thing about winning right now is that the Withers comes back too fast. He likely does not want to back him up for a race like the Gotham, even though he could, because he just wanted a mile, but he feels like a horse that you probably want to tack more distance onto as time goes by. Ultimately, looks like a certainty in the Wood Memorial. He's slow. He needs to get better. I just like this horse. I like this horse, and I like Tapit Trice. They're probably the types of big, slow horses that I fall for that don't end up amounting to much. But, I like him. I think he's game, and I thought he ran a race that was solid on Saturday. He needs to get faster, no doubt about it. But, he's one of those horses that'll go under the radar a little bit because, look, I mean, quite honestly, what happens in New York this time of year is not as really well regarded as what happens in places like Florida or Louisiana or even Arkansas.
We're going to get to the Silver Bullet Day in a second, talking Oaks Trail, but I did want to give you the opportunity to make any other comment that you might have on that future wager, if there was anything notable. I mean, I think we both agree, a little bit surprised that the Baffert category, number 40, closed at 2-1. You see anything else in there that surprised you? And like, would you have ever considered backing the Baffert category at as short as 2-1?
Oh, at 2-1, I would have. Yeah. I mean, I'm not dying to really make bets on 2-year-olds or on 2-1 shots, but I thought that was a pretty fair price. I mean, you start to stack up who he has, in all likelihood, future pool, I don't know what number it'll be. I guess this was 2. So 3. Future pool 4, this was 3. So future pool 5 will have all of his horses in them because they will have to be relocated to different trainers by then. So at that point, they will become eligible again, provided some of them have points. So my point being, when those horses get to other trainers, they're all going to get bet, right? I mean, we're talking about Arabian Night and Arabian Lion and Cave Rock and Reincarnate and Newgate and all these horses that have been running, relatively well. Some of the vanquished horses from the Los Alamitos Futurity. So, there's something to be said for that. So yeah, I would have taken the 2-1 there. I mean, looking through these, some of them were, I feel so bad for anybody that bet Loggins at 16-1. And we tried, and the word came out yesterday that Brad is hopeful that he gets him back in his barn on February 1st. And I mean, he's about 5 times that price to get to the race alone. So, but he was in the pool. I'll give you one. I mentioned Hit Show on Friday. He's running in the Southwest on Saturday. He's going to get a huge pace to run at. He was 77-1. I'd probably be willing to entertain him. Banishing, despite missing his race, went off 27-1. That's a little hard to believe. But one of the horses that I mentioned on Friday was Tapit Trice, who was 45, still a little low. I'd probably want, roughly 2 times that or so. I like Shopper's Revenge a little bit. 56-1 is low. So I don't think there ended up being a lot of value that we missed. But those are the ones that probably would have given me a little bit of attention. How about Extra and Yeho at 13-1?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I mean, I guess what happens is...
I'll give you twice that.
Yeah. There's little enough money bet that one, somebody associated with the team, or don't some of these have that kind of feel to it that somebody's just over betting the pot?
Yeah, they do. Exactly. I spend too much time looking at small pools nowadays, so I can see the difference that's made by one bet. There was what
244.
244,000 in
Yeah.
win bets. So I mean, it was, yeah, it was. The other thing is that Churchill's trying to do the right thing by getting more horses into this pool. Obviously, the best thing would be if it was open to everybody, but we're not equipped to handle that in a pari-mutuel fashion. I mean, one, I guess that we spoke highly of this horse on Friday. Cyclone Mischief was 44-1. I mean, the one thing about Cyclone Mischief that probably would concern you there is, I mean, if he has points and he's can stand up, Dale's running him.
Right.
So you have a very good chance to have some action there.
Yeah.
But he might also be more than 44-1 by then. So, that's the flip side of it. But yeah,
it was not bad. It's not, I'd reach there before, I mentioned about Giant Mischief. 27-1 doesn't do anything for me though. I was thinking that you might be able to, might get lost in the betting and you get 75-1, but it just, there's not a ton, but you know what though? I like going through it. I like the exercise. It just, I feel like getting more and more familiar with these form lines it's going to pay dividends down the line in just regular races for 3-year-olds, Triple Crown aside. So I'm happy we did that. And I say we push on and do it again for the other future pools. When's the next one? In about 3 weeks?
Yeah, February 10th to the 12th. So that's a little bit of a light weekend from a prep perspective. That'll be Sam F. Davis, and the pool will actually close shortly before kickoff for the Super Bowl.
Oh, that's kind of fun. That'll be a good weekend. Some crazy football coming up this weekend. I got away with it, by the way. I got away with my Brock Purdy play, being trying to be a wise guy and not using the Giants in my loser pool. I was watching cartoons with Perrin by the second quarter. No, that's not true. We watched the Weird Al movie in the second quarter. We didn't. There were no cartoons involved, but yeah, that was a little disappointing. But yeah, that's going to be a ton of fun. Let's talk Silver Bullet Day real quick, because the Alice look not only looked good for Brad Cox. Stop me if you've heard this one, but this one, and maybe you can give us some insight. You started to before into the figure making process. This number came back really strong. Especially with what we've been seeing in this division. How serious of an Oaks contender is the Alice look?
Yeah, I mean, 89 is the new 100 in the Philly 3-year-old Philly division. So you're right. I mean, and I'm not making light of it at all. It was a fast race by the standards of this crop. And look, I mean, in general, it's a fast race by the standards of 3-year-old fillies in January. So the situation here was that, this race was 1 mile and 70 yards. They went in 1:43.55 seconds. What happened here from a figure making perspective that does make you more comfortable with awarding a high figure is that, I mean, they buried everybody else. They were 13 plus lengths ahead of everybody else. So, you get into a situation like that, and from a figure making perspective, you almost let those horses sort of indicate what kind of race it was, because your assumption is that they ran their race, especially a horse like Ayu Navano, who had gotten 71 and a 65 fig 2 times in a row coming into that. Well, if you give Ayu Navano the 66 that she's run recently, that puts the winning fig in the high 80s. So it was a race with a relatively solid pace. I mean, not a super fast early, slow late situation. I believe on Timeform US, it came back relatively well. I'm sorry, Craig has not put his work in yet, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly fast pace. I mean, maybe 1/4 of it. So these horses looked good. I mean, they ran well. Chop Chop is a horse who somewhat shockingly went off a huge favorite in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, because every wise guy in the world thought that she would come from off the pace and win. And then Tyler Gaffalione took Wonder Wheel back, and she came from off the pace to win. So I'm excited to see these horses in the Rachel Alexandra and the Fairgrounds Oaks moving forward. Maybe Brad Cox splits them up. And if he didn't have 27 good 3-year-old colts, now he's got a couple of good fillies too.
Just for good measure. We got a fun week coming here on the network. Expecting a big announcement. We'll just leave it at that. But then we have some stuff we can talk about. We're going to be covering the Coast to Coast wagers later in the week, and then some special stuff for the Pegasus card. I'm going to be down there, which I'm looking forward to. I zip down there on Thursday. If you're around at Gulfstream, holler. Always fun to get a little bit of a meetup. Maybe we'll grab a drink somewhere with some listeners, viewers, etc. And then Duke Matisse, I think I said that, is going to be on the show, and we should be covering Florida thoroughly. So it'll be a very good week here. Keep it locked. If you had a look at all, I'm going to be doing horse by horse previews for the World Cup and the World Cup turf. In fact, I think I should probably be working on those today. What any early thoughts? Not necessarily selections, but just overview. I mean, the turf looked deep to me.
Yeah, good race. I mean, there are a couple of good races. You know, they don't have much star power, but that's okay because there really aren't very many stars in racing right now. You know, the handicap division is thin, so I think aside from Taba, everybody you'd expect to be there is there. So I'm excited to see it. You know, Defunded's a fast horse that will certainly be. He'll make his presence known, and I would imagine Irad will employ similar tactics to what he did last year on Life is Good. Cyberknife, obviously, pretty much every dance he danced, he showed up. So it's fun to have him in the mix as well. And the horses coming out of the local prep all ran very well, including Skippy Longstocking. I think it's safe to say that sometimes Saffie Joseph Jr.'s horses are just a little bit better at home. So I'm excited. I think it's I think it's a fun race, and everybody that, focuses on the right things is realizing that the Pegasus has not always been a great betting race. Right. It's often been dominated by favorites.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't think I can recall a non-favorite. Maybe the last non-favorite to win was City of Light. And that was only because Accelerate was favored. Right. So, it's just not that kind of running, which is fun. Let's get something more interesting.
What a tight band. I'm just glancing at Timeform US and their spotlight ratings. It's like, other than, you could take out maybe the low number for them is Last Samurai at 116. And then like everything else seems like it's between, there are exceptions, but it's tightly a lot of horses between 121 and 126 on their ratings. I think that speaks to the kind of race it is. I'm looking forward to going through it for our friends over at atheraces.com. I'll hopefully think of it. We'll link to it in our free newsletter, which if you're not signed up for, you should, because it's free and it's a great way to keep track of all the news, all the content, etc. in themoneypodcast.com/email for that one. Any closing thoughts for you, Nick, before we get out of here?
No, excited to keep chugging along the Derby Trail. I think we'll have a relatively quiet weekend Derby Trail wise, aside from the Southwest at Oaklawn. But, then we've got that big Saturday, first week in February. So here we go, headed towards May.
We're going to be doing a live stream for that as well. Don't have all the details yet, but that's going to be fun for the first Saturday in February. I will be here in the bunker, as I can't do the 2 weekends in a row in Florida as much as I'd like to, and get out of some of this rain we're having here in New York, or snow in the case of JK and Saratoga. There was one other programming note. Oh, if you're watching on YouTube, check out the audio of this show, because there's going to be an interview with a professional horse player you're going to want to hear, Maury Wolf, ahead of this in the audio version. But that's it. That's going to do it for this show. We'll thank Maury one more time. We'll thank you, Nick. We'll thank our founding partners, 10 Strike Racing and the Thoroughbred Retirement Foundation. To learn more about their mission to give generously to them, go to trfinc.org/players. Most of all, though, want to thank all of you, the listeners and viewers, for making these shows so much fun to do. This show's been a production of In the Money Media. Our business manager is Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge champion Drew Coatney. Our chief creative officer is Jonathan Kinchin. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. May you win all your photos.